and be just like another family in Manhattan. Well, if you're starting at 0, who's going to take care of the kids? The older ones would go to school, but the littlest one was only preschool. So, and then, how are they going to learn English? I don't know what they spoke in Cambodia or Thailand, but it wasn't English. Well, I'm sorry it's getting to you.
Do you want to go get a drink, or you okay?
Sure.
Oh, here.
No, you're good.
No.
I've got.
There's hers.
Okay, here you go. You're all choked up over this conversation, right?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the first things they did was the boys were used to fishing. So somebody would take them up to Tuttle Creek, below the tubes below the dam, and they'd fish. And lo and behold, they're starting to feed themselves. Catch the fish, go home, cook the fish, and you don't have to buy a fish in the store then. That was the beginning. Now we also had, and I don't see Helen Sanford.
Oh yes, Helen.
Helen Sanford was a woman who very competently was in charge of always having flowers every Sunday for Sunday worship. But also, she was a gardener, and Manhattan, back then even, had, what do they call it?
Community gardens.
Community gardens.
Yes.
And so these people were used to having gardens and raising stuff, vegetables mostly, so they could raise their vegetables. Well, here we are. We got fish, we got vegetables. They didn't buy a cow or a sheep. But the grocery store has a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And so how are they going to pay for the groceries? The church said, since we were the sponsor, we'll pay for the groceries, we'll pay for the rent, we'll pay for a car. They didn't know how to drive a car, and they never had a car. And they didn't know how to do a lot of things. What you will find in these minutes is that a lot of these things that needed to be done with the people in the family are spelled out. And so that's why I brought these along, and I think you'll find them very interesting. So I'll loan you those, and I want that one back. I want them all back.
Yeah.
Especially when I called the church office and asked them where the minutes of the committee were meeting, and they're going, we have no idea. So.
This committee, the refugee committee, just moved along on their own, and you will find that the first year, the church, through their mission committee in our operating budget, spent about $12,000. Now, that seems like a big sum, but remember that was for 2/3 of a year. 3/4 of a year. They came in March, and we're talking about March through December. And then we said, okay, now that's 1985. How about 1986? Need another 12,000. And finally, we said, as they're getting more acclimated, then the boys were working for money in people's yards, mowing or cutting weed, digging weeds and that kind of thing. And Ian, the mother, would go out and be a housekeeper for a couple of the members who were on the committee so they could get some money. This had two purposes. Not only they needed money, but also they needed to get familiar with our money. I mean, I don't know what they used back in Southeast Asia, but it wasn't dollars. So, and maybe you were involved too?
I worked one summer teaching Ian English.
English.
But it was a programmed, you would have, I would say this, and then she would repeat it. And she was very kind, but it really was not very helpful or a very exciting English lesson. So,
you got to start somewhere, don't you?
Yes.
Well, now, I've talked enough. What other questions have you got? This gets you started. And also what it takes to be a sponsor. Obviously it takes money, but it takes care and giving. And here's a family of 5, but this family was different than most families that come.
Yeah.
It didn't have a father or a husband. So the people, the relative who had gotten us into this, he was a man and he had a job in Manhattan, but here was this woman, and Ian at that point she was born in 1944, so she was 40 or 41 years old, and couldn't speak English till Mrs. Healy came along at last.
No.
And we had a long task ahead of us to get them integrated into our community,
Yeah.
full-fledged. Okay, well, the 2 boys were about high school age, maybe freshmen or sophomores. They were a little bit different in age, but they stayed in the same grade. They went through Manhattan High School, and in 1989, which is when this article was written by Newen. That was in the year they were seniors at Manhattan High.
Okay.
Now, fast forward. Have you ever heard of the Manhattan Area Technical School? It was called then. It's now called College. Votech. It's out near Griffiths, Seco Park.
Yeah.
And
Thick.
Newen took some classes for a couple of years and became an auto mechanic. And he has worked at the Chevrolet dealership ever since. Well, he got a job then at Murdoch Chevrolet, and that's where he's been ever since. And he's one of their very best mechanics. They send him to school periodically, and I happen to be an expert in income tax returns, so I did the returns for them. And let me just say, he has a nice salary. His brother went to Manhattan Area Votech School, and he became a body shop man. When cars get banged up, somebody has to straighten them out or put in a new part on the sides of the car and whatnot. And that's what he does. And he worked at who's the guy that flopped over all the time and backwards?
Dick Edwards.
Dick Edwards, Ford. But Dick Edwards Ford sold the place to somebody else. It's called Kanza, I think now.
Flint Hills.
Flint Hills.
Yes.
And they didn't want a bottle shop. So he's out of a job right now. Okay. Now, I've talked about the boys. Now, what was Ian doing? I should have started with her. Well, after she learned how to speak English, and after the committee advised her that she should stay home until all the kids were in full-time school. And then she got a job as not custodian, housekeeper in a motel here in Manhattan. And that's what she did for many, many years. This was a salaried job, and so this is a way they could help support themselves. Well, the church committee said, well, now that these people are starting to earn money on their own, the church doesn't need to furnish as much money. So you'll find in the minutes here that we recommended that instead of $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, why didn't we start phasing out to 11,000 the next year, 10,000 next year, 9, 8, 7. Well, we got to the point where they were almost self-sustaining, and then she turned 65. So she retired from this housekeeping job, and she was in the Social Security program, but the Social Security program amounts that she qualified for were only Well, you'll see it in the minutes.
Very small amount of money.
Well, $200 or $300 a month. So she was bringing in, what's 300 times 12?
Yeah.
3 times 12 is
36.
add 2 zeros.
3,600.
3,600.
Mhm.
Well, that's a lot different than what she was earning full time, which was, 9 or 10,000 a year. So all of a sudden, they're short again. So the church said,
That's right.
well, we're not going to go to zero quite so soon. So the church continued to give them $3,000 or $4,000 a year for another few years. But now gives them nothing. Now remember, at the same time, they had been paying rent for their trailer, but then it was kind of crowded in the trailer. 5 kids and mom, and so the family bought a house out in Northview area, on Griffith Drive. They're still there. The whole family lives there. Plus, I'll bring you up to date about, I guess it's about 10 years ago, each one of the family had said, oh, someday we'd like to go back as a tourist or as a visitor. And so Nguyen went back to Cambodia, and he went back to where the village still was, out in the middle of the country, and then he met a woman who had been grown up in a different village over in this area, and she was then working now in Phnom Penh, the capital, and 1 month later they were married. Now her name was Mum, spelled M-O-M. Sounds like mom, doesn't it? But it's you're written mom, but it's pronounced mum.
Like the flower.
What?
Like the flower. Mom.
Mum.
Like a chrysanthemum.
Yeah, chrysanthemum,
Yep.
yes. Now, she was a little younger, but about the same age as Nguyen, and they got married in Cambodia, but there was a problem. She didn't have a visa or any way to get to the United States. So he had to come back. He had a job to come back at the motor company. And about 1 year later, she finally got the paperwork from the State Department in the U.S., allowing her to enter as a alien, they're called. And more fast forwards. Nguyen, Touche, and Mum all have gone through the process to become citizens of the United States of America. And we went to each one of their ceremonies down in Topeka, where they were
Sworn in.
sworn in, yep.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting ceremony. And they're in a group, and the times we'd go, maybe there'd be 50, 60, 70 people being sworn in at the same time from all walks and ways of life, some of them being soldiers in the U.S. Army, and then you have to answer a whole bunch of questions and go through. Do you know anybody that's been naturalized, as they say?
They have to swear allegiance to the United States and refuse to have any allegiance to any king or potentate. I always like that word.
Or state.
Or state.
State being another word for country.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Well, I haven't talked about the girls.
Mhm.
The girls graduated from Manhattan High School, and then they each married a soldier. And guess where they met the soldiers? Fort Riley. Now, currently, one of them lives with her husband here in Manhattan. He's retired. the other one is, and her